Hi everyone, welcome to the video for Pro Tools lesson number 1, making the most of your Pro Tools system. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the parameters that you can control that will affect the work that you do in Pro Tools. Sometimes people go a long time before they start learning about these things, but knowing about these things can be an important way to enhance your workflow as you're working in Pro Tools. So here I have my Pro Tools session up and running and ready to go. And the first thing that we're going to be talking about is the Playback Engine. And the way you access the Playback Engine is by coming up here to the Setup window. So you're going to want to remember this, this menu right here, the Setup menu. It has a lot of things in it that can help you out, including your Preferences panel if you want to customize things in Pro Tools. We're going to start with the Playback Engine. Now, what happens a lot, more than you want it to, is sometimes you'll open Pro Tools, you'll push play, and you won't hear anything out, and you get frustrated, and you're like, why can't I hear anything? What's going on? Or sometimes you'll push play, and you'll hear sound coming out of your computer speakers instead of out of your monitors. So one of the first places you want to check is right here in your Playback Engine box. And one of the most useful things you can do here is just verify that you have your audio interface selected in your Playback Engine, or as your Playback Engine. So if I click on this menu, a pop-up menu opens with a lot of different options, including my MacBook Pro microphone and speakers, which are the built-in speakers, kind of a default, which I don't necessarily want. But here's the name of my audio interface, the Scarlett 2i2. And I've got it connected right now, so I'm going to select it. Every time you do this, this pop-up engine pops up and it says, if you select this, it's going to automatically close your session. But just click yes and let it close your session and then restart it. And then when it restarts, it will have your audio interface selected instead of whatever else it was using. I'm going to push cancel right now because I already have the audio interface. It's working for me. So anyway, it's a place where you can choose what hardware your sound is coming out of. And this is a place to double check and make sure that your sound is being routed to your audio interface so that it will be coming out of your monitors. The next thing that you can customize here is the hardware buffer size. And this has to do with the processing that Pro Tools does with your session when you're recording tracks and then when you're mixing. So most sessions start by recording tracks, right? And laying tracks down, and they end by polishing those tracks, by editing, by adding effects to those tracks. So depending on what type of work you're doing, you may want to adjust your hardware buffer size to accommodate that work. A good rule of thumb with hardware buffer size is the lower the sample size, the lower the latency while recording. So when you're recording your tracks, it's a good idea to select a low sample size because it will reduce latency. Conversely, when you're in the mixing phase, you kind of want to have more power to help you process all the plugins and things you're doing. So you want to change it to be to have more samples in your hardware buffer size, and that'll help during mixing. So you can select those things there, but keep in mind that what you're trying to avoid is latency. So latency is like a delayed sound out of your speakers. Like if I push a note down, you hear it a second later, and that's bad. Or when you play back your session, you'll see the scroll moving from side to side, but the audio that you're hearing is delayed. So, and that all has to do with how your computer, the power it has to process what's going on in Pro Tools at the moment. And if you have a lot of plugins in your session, that power gets drained. And so by manipulating the hardware buffer size, you can essentially relieve some of the burden of the processing that needs to happen during the session. Once again, low for recording and then higher for mixing. So you want to kind of customize it as you're doing your workflow. So other things in the Playback Engine dialog box are, you can customize parameters like ignore errors during playback, main Playback Engine, dynamic plugin processing, And then down at the bottom, you have your cache size. Usually a good idea to just keep that on normal. But anyway, that's the Playback Engine. Once again, you access it in your Setup menu by going Setup, Playback Engine, and there it is. And the next thing we're going to talk about is the hardware setup dialog box, also in the setup menu. So setup, you've got the hardware. That's actually the first thing there. And we're just going to briefly mention this, but it's a place where, once again, you can select your audio interface. I have the Scarlett 2i2 selected here. And that's pretty basic. If I had more than one audio interface, I would see both of them hooked up here. And other hardware, we're talking about external hardware that you can connect to your session, like if you have a reverb unit or a delay or some effects unit that's a physical unit that you're routing into your session. You can see it show up here. So since Scarlett is a third party to Avid, it's kind of basic, but if you were using an Avid audio interface, there would be a lot more options and controls here. But you do have some when you click the Launch Setup app. And it opens up this dialog box where you can have access to customize how your Scarlett interface is working within the Pro Tools setting. So that's the hardware setup. And once again, that is found in the Setup menu. You just go Setup Hardware. And the next thing we're going to talk about is the system usage window. And that is found here in the window menu. So we go window and then down to the very bottom, and it's called system usage. And this is kind of an interesting little window. It tells you how hard your computer is working. Notice that I have these yellow bars that are flashing and disappearing. Right now, my computer is not working very hard. It's not doing anything. Or in other words, Pro Tools isn't doing anything. But as soon as I push play, and as soon as audio starts to be processed, all of a sudden you can see the work that your computer is doing to process that audio. So it's kind of a neat visual representation to see how hard your computer is working in your session. Plus, it also has your memory here, your disk memory. So this would be your RAM, how much RAM Pro Tools is taking up on your computer, and it shows you a percentage there. So that's your system usage window, and you find it in the window menu. Just go down window and then system usage. The next one we're going to talk about is the session setup dialog box. And session setup dialog box, once again, we find it in the setup menu. You'll notice here that there is a keyboard command to find it, which is Command 2. And I'm talking about a Mac-based keyboard here, Command 2. And so I can either select it here in the setup window and it will appear, but I can also, on my keyboard, just hit Command 2, and now it disappeared. Reappeared, disappeared, disappeared. You go back and forth, making it appear and disappear. So that's Command and 2 to make this window appear and disappear. So what's it useful for? Well, let's say you got your Pro Tools session going and you set it up with certain parameters, but then you started your session and then you decided, oh, wait, I want to change that parameter. I don't want to keep it as that. For example, bit depth. Right now, my Pro Tools session is functioning at 24-bit bit depth. What if I wanted at a lighter bit depth, at 16-bit depth? I could change it right there. Or a bigger bit depth, a larger one, 32-bit depth. So you can customize the bit depth in here after you've already started your session. Another thing you can customize is the file type. What do you want? What type of file do you want your audio format to be? A WAV file, an AIFF file? You can choose those two things here. Interleaved status, it's a checkbox. It's a good idea to have it checked, but what interleaved means is it's when you're working with stereo files. A stereo file has two separate files, but when it's interleaved, those two separates become one. If it's not interleaved, then those two separate files are separated They become something called multi-mono files. Two mono files that are basically the same thing, but they're not connected. So anyway, it's a good idea to have those interleaved for me personally, because usually I don't want to have multi-mono files. I just want to, if I'm working in stereo, I just want to have a stereo file for that. One thing you cannot customize in this session setup window, and this is a question on the test, good to know, sample rate. Here I am with my sample rate. I selected 48 kilohertz at the beginning, and I'm clicking into it and nothing drops down. There's no triangle there. There's no drop-down menu. You cannot change the sample rate once you have already started a session with that sample rate. So you're just stuck with it. So just remember that sample rate cannot be changed. Bit depth can, wave type can, and all these other things can. Over here on the other side, session start, session length, time code, all of these things have post-production value for when you're like, let's say you're working with video and you're editing things. It's got this empty time code here. And anyway, you can adjust some of those things right here in the session setup window. I'm going to hit Command 2 and get rid of it. And Command 2 will bring it back. It's just kind of fun to go back and forth. So anyway, session setup. And the next thing we're going to talk about is the in and outs window. So if I come back here to setup, I also have something called I/O, stands for inputs and outputs. So here are my inputs and outputs, my in and output setup. Notice along the top, you have different tabs you can click to access different options what you work with. Probably the most common ones you're gonna do is input, output, and bus. Now, priorly in Pro Tools, this is all set up for you. I mean, the inputs and outputs are just, they come in a certain way and they work and they function. But at this point in your Pro Tools experience, you can start to customize your inputs and outputs and add them in different ways. So here's my input page. If I want to add an input, I would be on this tab. And then at the bottom, I'd click New Path, and then I can add a new input. There's another way to add a new input that you need to know about, and it's the command to do it. Command N. The keyboard command to do it, but it does use the command key. So by hitting Command N, you can also add new paths when you're working in here. So go ahead and just try that a couple of times, Command N. That is probably one of the questions you're going to get on the test. It's what is the keyboard command to add a new input and add a new output. So if you click onto the Outputs tab, which is right here, you can use that same command and you can add a new output. In fact, you can just keep this box open and hit the plus. And every time you hit the plus, you can add a new output and as many as you want or as you think you're going to need. And then last of all, you have the buses tab, and that's this tab right here. And so buses are a way of routing things through your computer setup. And it's important to remember that all track outputs are buses. The outputs of tracks are buses. They're the same things. And over here on this left side, it has the names of the bus. Notice that some of these names are bold. Like, for example, the one that I just selected, the top, it has bold lettering. That means that that is an active bus. It is a bus that's being used. These other buses don't have bold lettering. They're not active. They're not being used. So it's important to recognize that when the lettering is bold, it's because it's active and it's being used. Some other things to know are some buses have a little triangle on them and some don't. And if you click on that triangle, it will open a sub menu of sub buses. So right now, like I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I just counted 7 different buses that have sub bus paths. But here is a bus without a sub bus path. There's no triangle. Same thing here. There's no sub path. So you do want to be aware of that. There's also a difference between internal buses and outputs. And the main difference for when you're looking at it here is the checkbox. If you're working with a bus that does not have the green check in it, like these three on the bottom, and these three are internal buses because they don't have the green check mark. This green check mark here means that it's an output bus. So that is the difference. When you're looking in here, the internal buses do not have a check mark. The output buses do. If you click on the check marks, they go away. They become internal buses. If you click on it, it'll come back and we have outputs. Also, there's something called mirrored outputs, and this is a really cool concept. It's possible to take one output and route it to two different locations. And when you do that, you call that mirrored outputs. And how that would be handy is, well, you could route it to your monitors for one thing. That's probably what you're going to do. But you could also route it to a headphone mix for your headphones, and you could have the same signal going to two different locations for two different purposes. So to create a mirrored output, you're going to control click over the output that you want to mirror and then select it. And then that's how you're going to create it. All right, so we're just about finished. The last thing we're going to work on for today is our keyboard commands. So when you're studying Pro Tools and trying to learn it, it's important to also study the list of keyboard shortcuts at the end of each lesson. A lot of those keyboard shortcuts are going to be on the test that you take, are on the exam, and they are really handy. It really does make it so that you can function better in Pro Tools and get where you need to go. So let's do some exercises with those right now. We're going to start by doing the session setup, and that is simply Command 2. So go ahead and Command 2. And just do it over and over again, and sometimes it helps me to say it out loud. Command 2, session setup. Command 2, session setup. Command 2, session setup. Command 2, session setup. Let's practice the next keyboard command, which is adding inputs and outputs using the shortcut, which is Command N. By the way, you already need to open up your in and out setup box, which is setup and then IO. So here I am in and out setup, and I'm going to go Command N. New pass, I'm going to cancel, go Command N. New pass, I'm going to cancel, Command N. Cancel, Command N. I'm just practicing, so I'm doing it over and over, so I just get used to do it. Command N to create new paths there. Now, and just for clarification, if you do Command N not in the in and out box, you get the dashboard to start over with a new session. So it's important to know that there's two different things that can happen when you do Command N. There's the dashboard, or when you're in the in and out box, it creates a new path for you. One more thing to talk about in relation to the in and out setup is the options you have to save and share your settings. So you can take all these customizable settings that you've built and you can save them so that if you were going to go to a different Pro Tools setup, you could use your own inputs and outputs there. And so it's really pretty cool. You can, and you would do that by clicking this Export Setting button. And right here, you have an option of naming your setting, whatever you want to. And then here it gets saved in your IO settings, in and out settings. It's one of the settings you have in your Pro Tools files that isn't actually there. So you can save your in and out settings. But if you can save them, that also means that you can import them or import them, a different setting option. So if I hit import and I come here and I have all these options of different in and out settings that I can import. I just want to point out to you that in and out files from Pro Tools are called PIO files, PIO. So the P stands for Pro Tools, the I is for in, and the O is for out. So it's just good to know that because you're going to see these kind of files and you're going to be reading about it in your book and wondering what they are. But these PIO files are specifically for importing and exporting the in and outs of a Pro Tools session. One important thing to understand is when you import settings, you only import the tab that is open. So right now I have the bus tab open. So if I was to go import settings and import it, it would just import the settings for the bus tab. But I have other things here. I have the outputs and the inputs and the inserts. What if I want all these tabs to import when I'm doing this import process instead of having to do it one-on-one? So if I want to import all the tabs at the same time, then I simply need to push Option, then import settings. And when I hold down Option as I import the settings, it will import all the tabs instead of just one. All right, well, I think that wraps it up for today's lesson. Thank you for coming here, and I'll see you in the next video.